The stages of grief aren't real? What?
All right.
All right, it's not that the stages of grief aren't real. It's actually just that research has found decades ago that that's actually not how people grieve. So a lot of those experiences that occur in things like 5 stages of grief, 7 stages of grief, those can actually still occur in the grieving process. Things like sadness, anger, denial, acceptance. But actually, we don't really grieve when we lose things. We don't really grieve in the way of, kind of discreetly going through each stage one at a time until we get to the end. Now, some people say, or some theorists will say, well, you can go back and forth between the stages. And actually, that's not how people tend to grieve either. First of all, that wouldn't make them stages at all, but that's just an aside. But really, actually, any of those difficult experiences, any of those specific emotions people experience, sadness, anger, etc., those things can actually happen all at once, like all at the same time, or, people can fluctuate between those, at any given rate, at any given time. That's really not predictable. Now, grief is really a valid experience. I mean, it's difficult for any of us. And, any of us will experience grief at least a couple times in our life, with the loss of, a family member or a spouse or a breakup of a relationship, right? There's multiple different experiences where we can experience grief. But what they found is actually grief tends to come in waves. You often hear people talk about grief that way. But it comes in waves in the sense of what they call the dual process model. This is sort of what research has found is the way, sort of accurate way, the depiction of how people grieve. Now, what happens in that is that people sort of fluctuate back and forth between loss and restoration-oriented coping. So loss-oriented coping, is really, what we typically think about as grief, really feeling sadness, feeling down, sometimes anger, sometimes denial. Whereas restoration-oriented coping, is kind of people can fluctuate to the other side at a certain point, and start to feel, things like gratitude or inspiration for what, the thing that they had that they lost taught them, or how they might sort of get back to feeling good in their life and sort of rebounding from that. But what happens is that people can experience that restoration-oriented coping and then fluctuate back to loss, and people just kind of go back and forth between those things. And that's actually a really natural, normal pattern of grieving. And what happens over time is those kind of fluctuations or waves between loss and restoration-oriented coping actually get smaller and smaller until people sort of level out and sort of start to feel like they did before the loss. And so what happens for people with things like prolonged grief or complicated grief is that they actually go sort of up and down at first, but then they'll actually sort of fall into a pattern of more loss-oriented coping for long, extended periods of time. And that loss-oriented coping also has additional experiences on top of it, things like ruminating and always sort of fixating and focusing on the person, maybe thinking a lot about, what I should have done or should not have done, should or should not have said to them, or if it's the loss of an individual, what I should or should not have done, and say the loss of a relationship or something like that, and pining over the person, things like that. And that can be a really difficult experience that can last sometimes even years or even decades. The good news, though, is that there is hope through things like counseling and sort of newer research-based, evidence-based treatments. People have been found to find their way out of that prolonged pattern of grieving and sort of back to a non-grieving pattern. If you're interested in that, I've got some posts on that, so I'll link those here. So hopefully that was helpful today in talking about sort of what appear to be sort of more accurate or valid representations of how people grieve. We will see you next time.